The recording starts at 04:17:9 shipboard time, which is the moment the Vashtori opened fire on the Mercy Corridor convoy. I know this because the escape pod's black box was keyed to the same synchronized clock as the convoy flagship, and when I was finally recovered 3 years, 2 months, and 11 days later, the first thing the retrieval team's forensic technician said to me was, "The clock never stopped." She said it like it was a miracle. I told her the clock stopping would have been a mercy. My name is Daravasek. At the time of the Mercy Corridor incident, I held the rank of Senior Intelligence Analyst, 2nd grade, attached to the Terran Relief Authority's Escort Division. I was not military. I was not supposed to be anywhere near a combat engagement, because there was not supposed to be a combat engagement. The Cathara Compact had been in force for 11 years. The convoy was flying under its protections. 31 ships, 214,000 human beings. Doctors, nurses, engineers, aid workers, and the small auxiliary crew that kept those vessels running in the cold between stars. Every one of them was a designated non-combatant. Every one of them was wearing it plainly. The white hull panels, the Red Cross plaque above each forward airlock, the running lights set to the compact's defined mercy pattern of slow amber pulses. The Vashtorsh Dominion had signed that compact. They had sat at the table in Cathara Station's Great Hall and inscribed their mark onto the treaty alongside 11 other species and every sovereign human government. The ceremony had taken 3 days. There had been a reception afterward. I attended that reception. I remember the Vashtori diplomat, a Tier 3 envoy named something I could approximate as Orithis, moving through the human crowd with the rolling, angular gait of a species whose joints articulate backward at the hip. They were tall, they had 4 eyes, each on an independent orbital stalk, and the inner pair was always tracking something the outer pair was not looking at. I remember thinking there was something deeply attentive about their physiology, that a species built to watch 4 things at once must have evolved in an environment where inattention was fatal. I remember thinking they seemed intelligent, careful, present. I was right about all of it. I had just misunderstood what those qualities were pointed at. The Mercy Corridor was a transit lane established under the compact specifically for relief operations, a narrow passage through the Vashtori outer systems, granted to any vessel flying the Mercy pattern lights. We were transiting it en route to the Pellerin margin, where a resource collapse had left some 600,000 people in a deteriorating situation. Our cargo holds were full of water purification units, field hospitals, protein synthesis equipment, seed stock, and 200 tons of basic pharmaceutical supplies. The lead ship, the Covenant Reach, was carrying 43 surgeons. I was on the Covenant Reach as the Tier A's embedded intelligence observer. My job was to monitor the political situation in the surrounding systems and flag anything that might affect the convoy's safe passage. I had filed 3 reports in the preceding 10 days, each rating the transit risk as low. The Vashtori had given us no signals of concern. Their patrol vessels had cleared us at the corridor's entry point with routine efficiency. Scans, manifest verification, the exchange of authentication codes. The officer who processed our entry authorization spoke in the clipped, businesslike register of a bureaucrat who had done the same task 500 times and expected to do it 500 more. I submitted my 3rd low-risk assessment at 03:58 shipboard time, 19 minutes before the attack began. I have spent a great deal of time, in the years since, thinking about what I missed. Not for the purposes of self-reproach. That particular avenue becomes less useful the longer you walk it, but because the answer to what I missed is the answer to what the Vashtori were actually doing. And that answer is what the Terran Directorate eventually used to construct the legal and moral architecture of the Iron Accord response. What I missed was this. The Cathara Compact had, in the Vashtori interpretation, an expiration mechanism embedded in its framework that no human party had understood. Under their doctrine of territorial reinscription, a concept so deeply woven into their system of sovereign law that they had apparently assumed, every species in the room understood it. Any passage right granted through a home system corridor automatically lapsed after the 4th use, unless the granting party performed an active reinscription ceremony at the corridor's midpoint. The ceremony was a physical act. conducted aboard a Dominion administrative vessel, involving the exchange of what I can only describe as jurisdictional tokens, physical objects bearing the biometric markers of both parties' authorized signatories, verified by a Dominion recorder. It was not symbolic. In Vashtori law, it was the literal renewal of consent. No one had told us. In the Compact's original negotiations, the Vashtori had submitted their legal framework in summary form, as all parties had. The summary described the corridor passage right as renewable upon mutual accord, a phrase that, to any human lawyer present, read as boilerplate. It was not boilerplate. The mutual accord was the reinscription ceremony, and the failure to perform it was, under Dominion law, equivalent to the human party's unilateral termination of the passage right. Our convoy was the fifth human transit through the Mercy Corridor. In their interpretation, we had been trespassing since we crossed the entry threshold. They did not tell us this. This is the piece I have had to think about most carefully in the years since, because there are two ways to understand it. One way is to see it as a catastrophic failure of cross-species legal translation, genuinely different frameworks colliding without adequate bridging. The other way is to observe that the Vashtori had watched 4 prior human convoys transit the corridor without performing the ceremony, which means they had watched the condition develop across 4 transits without once flagging it through any compact channel, without once notifying the TRA that a compliance issue was accumulating, without once suggesting to the compact authority that a clarification was needed. They had watched us build up 4 unchallenged transits, and then they had assembled 16,000 warships and positioned them in the corridor's shadows, and waited for the 5th. Understanding this required me to understand something about Vashtori political culture that I had known in outline, but had not fully internalized until I had 3 years to sit with it. The Vashtori were not expansionist in the way that word usually implies. They did not want territory in the conventional sense. What they wanted was what their entire legal cultural system was organized around producing: the maintenance of a specific kind of hierarchical clarity. In their framework, the universe was arranged in tiers of recognized authority, and transit rights through a species' core systems were among the most sensitive markers of where in that hierarchy a given species sat. Granting passage through Dominion space was, in their view, a sovereign gift. Not a neutral logistical arrangement, but an act of condescension in the technical sense of that word. A superior acknowledging a lesser and permitting access as an expression of generosity. The reinscription ceremony was not merely a renewal procedure. It was a reaffirmation of the hierarchy. The lower party came to the Dominion vessel. The lower party's signatory presented their biometric token. The Dominion recorder verified it and returned the authorization. The meaning of the ceremony was, you are here because we permit you to be here, and you have come to acknowledge that again. Skipping the ceremony was not, in their framework, merely a contractual oversight. It was a statement of status. The behavior of a party that had forgotten it was the lesser. After 4 unchallenged transits, the Vashtori had, in their own terms, been patient. They had allowed the oversight to accumulate. On the 5th transit, they corrected it. The correction was calibrated to serve 2 purposes simultaneously: to enforce the reinscription doctrine in a way that would generate a compact record establishing the legal justification, and to remind every observing species of the tier structure and what it meant to ignore it. The hospital ships going first was not incidental to that message. It was the message in its most explicit form. We are permitted to do this. That is what the Red Cross means in the context of your relationship to us. Nothing. When we decide, it means nothing. I have reached a settled view on those 2 interpretations, and I will state it plainly. The first is not wrong as a technical matter, but the second is what was actually happening. The Vashtori did not fail to communicate a legal technicality. They chose not to communicate it because a communicated technicality is a correctable technicality, and a correctable technicality does not produce an enforcement action. They wanted the enforcement action. The Mercy Corridor was not a misunderstanding that escalated. It was a planned operation in which the legal framework served as the pretext, and the 5th transit was the trigger they had been waiting for. I know this because of the 30-hour pre-positioning of 16,000 warships in sensor-damped formation, which the post-action reconstruction confirmed. You do not hold 16,000 warships in tight sensor-damped formation for 30 hours because a legal technicality surprised you. The first Vashtori warship appeared off our port quarter at 04-1652. I saw it on my secondary display, an Ascendant-class Dominion cruiser, 1,400 meters of angular composite hull, its weapon arrays extended and tracking. It was not in any patrol configuration I had ever cataloged. I had 7 seconds to register that fact before a second warship appeared off starboard, and then 2 more dead ahead, and then the display started filling in contacts, the way a winter sky fills with stars when the cloud cover breaks, all at once, from everywhere. I had time to open a channel to the bridge and say the word contact before the Vashtori fired. They did not fire on the Covenant Reach first. They fired on the hospital ships. I want to be precise about this because imprecision has been used in the intervening years to soften what happened, and I will not contribute to that softening. The Vashtori Dominion, in the opening seconds of what they would later categorize as a corridor, enforcement action, targeted and destroyed the 6 designated hospital ships in the convoy before engaging any other vessel. Those ships were the most visibly marked vessels in the formation. They were flying Mercy pattern lights. Their Red Cross plaques, physical, mounted, meters wide, painted in the specific pigment spectrum the compact mandated, were lit from the inside. You could read them from 200 kilometers. The Vashtori weapons officers would have seen them on their targeting displays at 10 times that distance. They fired on the hospital ships first. I have never been satisfied with any explanation for the sequencing that does not account for its deliberateness. Some analysts have suggested it was strategic, that the hospital ships, as the least combat-capable vessels, represented the fastest path to convoy disintegration. This is true, but it is not sufficient. Even the most coldly tactical targeting calculus does not require opening with the ships carrying the Red Cross. You can disintegrate a convoy by taking the lead ship. You can cut off coordination by targeting escort vessels. You can achieve tactical dissolution in a dozen ways that do not require your first 6 shots to land on the most visibly protected ships in the formation. The Vashtori chose to open with those 6 ships. I believe they understood what the Red Cross meant. I believe they understood it and fired on those ships, first because the message was not addressed to us. It was addressed to every species monitoring what happened in the Mercy corridor that day. The message was about the scope of the enforcement actions coverage. It was about what they considered permissible. It was about what they considered us. The Covenant Reach shuddered when the first detonations hit. I was thrown against my console hard enough to crack 2 ribs, which I did not know until much later. I pulled myself upright on the handhold above my station and looked at my display, and what I saw was the convoy dying, not engaging, not fighting back. We had no weapons, dying. The Vashtori warships were moving through the formation with the methodical efficiency of a process, not a battle. They were sweeping from the hospital ships outward, burning through the Mercy pattern vessels in order of medical capacity. There was a logic to it that was almost administrative. The Covenant Reach's captain, a woman named Tolev, who had spent 30 years in the TRA and had the kind of face that looks like it was carved from riverstone, came over the shipwide channel and told us to get to the escape pods. She said it in the same voice she used to announce meal times. There was no tremor in it. I have thought about that voice many times. She knew what was coming. She decided that if she was going to spend her last minutes doing anything, it was going to be giving the people in her charge whatever second she could buy them. I was in a survival suit and threw my pod's hatch in 4 minutes. Around me, in the Covenant Reach's central escape corridor, I could see other crew members doing the same. Moving fast, not running, not screaming, the training taking over the way it is supposed to. I sealed my pod, initiated the launch sequence, and the pod's camera system came online as the ejection charge fired. I watched the Covenant Reach die from 112 meters away. The Vashtori weapon that destroyed her was a coherent energy lance, a sustained beam that held on the hull for 6 seconds before the structural integrity of the forward section gave way. 6 seconds is a very long time when you are watching it happen. The camera did not look away. Neither did I. The hull fractured in a sequence that I have since been told corresponds to a known failure mode in that class of vessel. Forward, frame failure propagating aft along the main keel in a fraction of a second, the ship becoming not one object but many objects, moving outward from their common center with the velocity of whatever pressure was inside them when containment failed. I will not attempt to describe what the destruction of 31 ships looks like from inside the debris field. I will say only that the Vashtori did not leave. They swept through the field for 40 minutes afterward, firing on every contact that registered a life sign or a functional system. I lost count of the pod signatures I tracked on my display before it started showing individual destruction events faster than I could process them. I cut the display feed. I sat in the dark with the escape pod's sound insulation doing its job, and the faint vibrations of distant detonations reaching me through the hull, and I sat with it. The Vashtori swept the corridor for 40 minutes. Then they left. When the last contact signature faded from my passive sensor, I ran a full diagnostic. My pod was functional. My air recycler would run for 8 months. My water reclamation system was intact. My emergency beacon was broadcasting on 3 frequencies, encrypted to T-ray protocols, with enough power to reach a relay station at a range of 40 light minutes. I was the only escape pod that had survived the sweep. I ran the sensor check 3 times because I did not believe the result. I was alone in the Mercy corridor in a debris field that had been 31 ships and 214,000 people, and the nearest T-ray relay station was 11 light hours away. The pod's beacon began broadcasting at 052 shipboard time. The clock never stopped. 11 light hours means 11 hours of travel at light speed. For a retrieval to reach me in under a year, a relay station would have needed to be monitoring the frequency continuously and to have had a fast courier immediately available. Neither condition held. The relay station received my signal. It passed it up the chain. The chain was occupied with other things. The Vashtori Dominion had filed a formal notification with the Kithara Compact Authority 48 hours after the attack. The notification described the incident as a lawful corridor enforcement action under the doctrine of territorial reinscription. It cited the specific legal mechanism, named the relevant compact provision, noted that the corridor had been used without reinscription on 5 occasions, and expressed willingness to participate in compact facilitated discussions on the clarification of passage right renewal procedures for future human transit applications. They described the matter as closed, and they described it that way not with defiance, but with the routine confidence of a party filing paperwork after a predictable administrative outcome. They expected a process. They expected protests, counterfilings, a formal censure, perhaps a sanctions regime, the familiar machinery of galactic diplomacy, grinding away at a grievance for years while the relevant ships stayed destroyed and the relevant dead stayed dead. They expected this because it was the only response the galaxy had ever given to that class of action. The Vashtori had, in the preceding century, conducted 4 other enforcement actions against weaker species transit rights in Dominion space. In each case, the process had produced exactly what it produced. The most significant of those cases, involving a species called the Polani, had taken 11 years and produced a financial settlement and a clarification of reinscription requirements. The Polani had been grateful for the settlement. The Vashtori had resumed operations in the affected corridor within 6 months of the settlement's conclusion and had conducted 2 more enforcement actions in the 30 years since without generating anything more substantial than a notation in the Compact's dispute registry. In their model of how the universe worked, the calculus was simple and had been verified 4 times. A species below a certain threshold of response capacity would absorb the cost of non-response because absorbing it was less expensive than the alternative. The key variable was the threshold, and the threshold was determined by what a species had available to deploy. Their intelligence assessment of humanity's military capacity was, by all accounts I have reviewed, technically accurate. They had correctly cataloged what humanity had built and deployed under the compact framework in the preceding 11 years. What they had not cataloged was what humanity had been building outside the framework. I did not know this while I was in the pod. I pieced together the shape of the Vashtori's expectations from what I could reconstruct, alone with my professional training and 3 years of uninterrupted analytical time. I want to be clear about what those 3 years were, because the popular account of my time in the pod has sometimes rendered it as a period of helpless waiting, and that is not accurate. It was the most sustained analytical work of my career. It had the advantage that no one could interrupt it, and the disadvantage that the only data I had was what I had brought in my head when I sealed the hatch. The early months were the hardest in ways that had nothing to do with the physical. The physical was its own category of difficulty. Rationing, air quality management, the carefully structured daily routine I built in the first 2 weeks, because I understood that routine was load-bearing in a psychological sense that the pod's designers had not been thinking about when they engineered it for 72-hour survival. I gave myself tasks. I maintained detailed logs, not the black box automatic recording, but my own written logs, because the act of writing in sentences that someone might eventually read was a way of insisting that someone eventually would. I ran through everything I knew about the regional political context of the Vashtori systems and the compact's enforcement history, building and rebuilding the model of what had happened and why. By the 4th month, I had a clear enough picture of their legal doctrine that I could reconstruct the outline of their formal justification from first principles. By the 6th month, I had reached a working hypothesis about their expectations that I did not yet have the data to confirm, but that the structure of the attack, the calm positioning, the 40-minute sweep, the formal notification filed 48 hours later with the procedural confidence of someone who already knows the result, supported strongly. The hypothesis was this: the Vashtori had calibrated their action against a model of human response capacity that was built from observable data. The observable data was accurate. What they had missed was the unobservable data, what humanity had been doing outside the frameworks anyone was. Monitoring. This was not optimism. It was professional assessment, worked out with cold discipline over 6 months of thinking, and I held it as a hypothesis precisely because I did not have confirmation. But I had been an intelligence analyst for 11 years, and I had worked long enough in the directorate's analytical apparatus to know the kind of people who ran its long-range security division. Those were not people who received 4 Vashtori enforcement actions against 4 other species and filed them as someone else's problem. Those were people who looked at a pattern and asked what the pattern predicted, and then asked what it would take to break the prediction, and then asked what it would take to build something large enough to break it with finality rather than with just enough force to create a counterpressure that could be waited out. I worked through the Vashtori's prior enforcement actions in order, from the earliest to the most recent, using what I had in my head from 11 years of regional briefings. I mapped the escalation arc, each action slightly larger in scope than the last, each settlement slightly less favorable to the aggrieved party than the one before it, the interval between actions slightly shorter as the Dominion refined its assessment of what the compact's response machinery could sustain. The Polani case, the longest and most extensively documented in the compact record, had the clearest trajectory. From the initial action to the final settlement, the Dominion had never once departed from the expectation that time and process worked in their favor. They had been right. Time and process had worked in their favor. The Polani were still a spacefaring civilization, technically, in the way that a patient with a chronic degenerative condition is still technically healthy. The Vashtori model was not secret. It was simply invisible to anyone who was not looking for it, and most parties were not looking for it because looking at it meant acknowledging an implication that was uncomfortable to acknowledge. The compact's dispute resolution machinery was not a mechanism for producing justice. It was a mechanism for producing settlements, and settlements and justice are not the same thing. The compact was designed by parties that needed to coexist and had varying capacities for forcing outcomes. A framework built by parties with varying capacities will, over time, tend to produce outcomes that reflect those capacities rather than the framework's stated principles. This is not a criticism of the compact's founders. It is an observation about what frameworks become when they are not reinforced by something outside them. The Iron Accord was the something outside. I did not know about the 580,000 hulls. I did not know about the 7 dry dock facilities or the asteroid fields or the procurement records that hid the hull components in plain sight. But I had spent a professional lifetime learning to assess what people and institutions were capable of when they had sufficient cause and sufficient time. The directorate had both. I held that hypothesis through the rest of the first year, and through the second year, and into the third. The pod systems did what they were designed to do. My air recycler ran, my water reclamation ran, my rationing protocols kept me functional. I will not detail the physical effects of 3 years in a single person pod because they are in the medical record, and because they are not the point, and because the 214,000 people who died in the Mercy Corridor debris field around me did not have medical records to file afterward, and their absence from the rest of this account should not be mistaken for their absence from what I was carrying in that pod. I talked to them. I am aware that this is the detail that tends to define how people understand my 3 years, and I will address it directly. I talked to Captain Tolev. I talked to the 43 surgeons by name. Working through the manifest I had memorized from 11 days of reading it. I talked to the crew members I had watched in the escape corridor. I talked to the Covenant Reach itself at one point, which tells you something about what isolation does to the edges of a person's categories after a sufficient duration. I am not embarrassed by any of it. A person alone in a debris field with 214,000 dead develops their own protocols for managing that company, and mine served their purpose. When the retrieval vessel finally reached me, 3 years, 2 months, and 11 days after the attack, the crew who came through the docking collar were careful with my condition. The ship's medic was a young man who had been briefed on what to expect and who had clearly, despite the briefing, not been fully prepared. He got me onto a medical bunk and started his assessments, and at some point he looked up with an expression that had more in it than he knew how to ask. I said, "It was the hospital ships first." He nodded. He said he knew. I said, "Make sure that stays in the record, not as a detail, as the first thing." He said it would. I was given the full after-action briefing 46 days after my retrieval, in a medical recovery suite on Terran Station Kalos, by a directorate liaison officer named Vorn. He was a compact, quiet man with a deliberate Stilisthoff find in people who have spent long careers in sensitive positions. Not the suppression of affect, but a practiced sense of what to display and when. He sat across from me in the recovery suite's 2 chairs and laid a datapad on the table between us without reaching for it, and he told me what had been built and what it had done. I listened without interrupting. I had learned, in the pod, a great deal about the utility of silence. The Iron Accord fleet had launched from the Terran system's outer reaches 28 months after the Directorate confirmed the Mercy Corridor attack. 28 months from the date of confirmation, not from the date of my retrieval, which had not yet happened when it launched. I was still in the pod, alone in the debris field, when 580,000 warships began their transit. The timeline was built around readiness, not around my survival. I want to be clear that I do not say this as a criticism. Readiness mattered more than I did, and I would not have had it otherwise. The point of the Iron Accord was not to rescue one analyst. The point of the Iron Accord was to answer what had been done with something that could not be misread as anything other than an answer. The Iron Accord was the name the Directorate had used internally for the response capacity it had been assembling since the day the Cathara Compact was signed. It was never announced. It never appeared in any public record, any budget line, any procurement document accessible to non-human parties. The ships were assembled in 7 deep space dry dock facilities in the Terran system's outer reaches, each facility constructed within an existing asteroid field where its thermal and electromagnetic signature could be masked by ambient debris. Individual hull components were manufactured through the standard civilian supply chain, categorized in procurement records as infrastructure components for deep space relay stations. Only in the hidden yards were those components assembled into their final form. The completed ships carried no serial numbers, no hull registrations, none of the identification systems required by Compact Treaty, because they were never intended to operate within the Compact framework. They were designed from the first blueprint to operate outside it entirely, as an answer to a question the compact had never been equipped to ask. The Directorate had spent 11 years calculating what the cost threshold looked like for a species that measured the permissible by the affordable, and then building something large enough to make the calculation incoherent. The engineering decisions reflected this. The Iron Accord ships were not built to the standards of Terran fleet vessels designed for long operational deployments, fleet logistics support, or the kind of sustained presence that a peacetime military maintains in contested space. They were built to a single specification: deliver maximum destructive capacity at a designated target within a defined operational window, and return. Their fuel loads were optimized for a single outward transit and a single return. Their crew complement was lean. Automated systems handled the work that Terran fleet doctrine typically assigned to larger crews because crew size drives resupply requirements, and the Directorate did not intend to resupply these ships in the field. Their weapon systems were the heaviest that could be fitted to their hull classes, with minimal concession to defensive capacity. Because defensive capacity is what you optimize for when you expect an exchange. The Accord's architects did not design for an exchange. They designed for an answer. 11 years, 7 facilities. The patience required to build 580,000 warships in complete secrecy through a civilian supply chain across a decade-long procurement cycle that never generated a suspicious budget signature is not the patience of an organization that was improvising. It is the patience of an organization that looked at the pattern of Vashtori enforcement actions and decided, 11 years before the Mercy Corridor, that the response needed to be ready before the provocation, because the provocation would arrive when the Vashtori chose, not when humanity was prepared for it. Someone in the Directorate's long-range security division, 11 years before I sat alone in a debris field, had looked at the pattern and decided it pointed this way. I find that I am grateful to whoever that was. I find also that I am unable to say it without an awareness of what the preparation cost, not in resources, not in secrecy, but in the weight of it, of knowing for 11 years that something was coming and building the answer to it while also continuing to send relief convoys through Dominion, controlled corridors under treaty protections that the builders of the answer already knew might not hold. Vorn said the number the way you say something that has become familiar through repetition, flat, without the register of surprise, because surprise had long since given way to the steady weight of the thing itself. 580,000 warships. I asked him to repeat it, not because I had not heard it, but because I needed to hear it again in the same room, in the same flat voice, to verify that the number was real and not a feature of my own 3 years of isolated thinking. He repeated it without inflection. 580,000 warships. The Iron Accord fleet's aggregate mass exceeded the combined mass of every other military asset any signatory of the Cathara Compact had ever produced or declared. It was not built to match the Dominion's military strength. It was not built to exceed it by a comfortable margin. It was built to exceed any conceivable Dominion response by a factor large enough that the concept of response became structurally incoherent, not a calculation of who would win the exchange, but an architecture in which the exchange did not exist, only the answer, and the answer was not open to interpretation. The fleet's transit to the Vashtori home system took 11 days. It made no attempt at stealth. Its sensor profile at full transit configuration would have been visible to the Dominion's early warning arrays for approximately 9 days before arrival. This was intentional. I asked Vorn why they had not approached under stealth, given the capability existed, he said. Because we wanted them to see it coming. The 9 days were part of the message. I thought about that for a moment. It was the correct decision. 9 days of watching an answer approach on your sensors, unable to stop it, unable to negotiate it away, unable to do anything except watch it get larger on the display. That is a different experience than the thing arriving without warning. The warning was the first sentence of the answer. The arrival was the second. The 9 days produced exactly what they were designed to produce. The Vashtori attempted every option available to them in the time. Their military mobilization produced everything the Dominion could activate on. Short notice, The post-action confirmation certified 16,412 warships brought to ready status. Their evacuation attempts were constrained by transport capacity. The home system's civilian shipping could move at maximum throughput. Roughly 4% of the 3 inhabited worlds' combined population before the fleet arrived. Some did evacuate. The numbers are in the record. Their negotiation attempts were extensive and increasingly urgent. The Vashtori transmitted on every available frequency through every diplomatic channel still technically accessible. They transmitted the full legal argument for territorial reinscription doctrine with supporting citations. They transmitted reparations offers, specific figures in compact recognized value units, covering the 214,000 dead. And when those produced no response, they transmitted higher figures. And when those produced no response, they transmitted requests for parley, for ceasefire, for emergency compact authority sessions. They transmitted, in the last 48 hours before the fleet's arrival, direct appeals to the Iron Accord's command structure that included, Vorn said, expressions of considerable urgency. None of it received a reply. The Iron Accord fleet arrived at the Vashtori home system on what would have been, by Terran reckoning, a Tuesday morning. The lead elements, a vanguard of 60,000 warships, entered at the heliopause and broadcast a single transmission on all Vashtori monitored frequencies. The transmission was 23 seconds long. It named the Mercy Corridor incident by date and casualty count. It listed each of the 31 convoy ships by designation. It stated that what followed was not a military engagement, not a law enforcement action, and not a negotiation. It stated that it was a consequence. The transmission was sent once. It was not repeated. I want to pause here and be precise about something, because precision is owed, and because I have seen the vagueness that creeps into popular accounts of the Iron Accord action in the years since, and I will not allow that vagueness to stand in a record I am contributing to. The Vashtori who died in the Iron Accord action were not all soldiers. The Dominion's inhabited worlds had civilian populations. The Directorate's architects were aware of this. The design of the operation, what Vorn described as the architecture of the response, was built around a principle that I am going to state plainly, because I believe vagueness on this point is a disservice to everyone who deserves an honest accounting. The Vashtori Dominion's decision to fire on the Mercy Corridor convoy was not the act of rogue officers or a dissident faction operating outside the government's knowledge. It was the lawful, authorized, formally notified action of the Dominion as a sovereign entity, executed in full conformity with Dominion law, and subsequently defended by the Dominion government in the compact record. A government that executes a policy of deliberate non-combatant killing defends it in formal interstellar record, and transmits its legal justification as though the justification settles the matter. That government has made itself, as an entity, the responsible party for what the policy produced. The Iron Accord architects did not distinguish between the Dominion's military and civilian components in the operation's design because the Dominion had not made that distinction available by the nature of how it had acted and what it had defended. This is a hard principle to hold. I know it is hard. I'm still holding it, and I have not found the holding easier in the years since. But the alternative, treating the authorized, defended mass killing of non-combatants as an action for which only a portion of the authorizing entity bore responsibility, would have been a comfortable fiction, and the Directorate did not trade in comfortable fictions, and neither will I. What the operation targeted on the inhabited worlds was not the populations. It was the architecture of Dominion governance, administrative centers, military installations, communications infrastructure, power distribution networks, the physical structures through which the Dominion exercised its authority as a political entity and projected its capacity for action. Those structures were destroyed. The civilian populations were not systematically targeted. The Dominion, as a functioning governmental body capable of projecting military power, ceased to exist. The action lasted 19 hours and 41 minutes. In the first 4 hours, the Vashtori military offered organized resistance. Their 16,000 warships were well maintained, their tactical coordination was competent, and their crews were clearly trained for conventional defense operations. against the Iron Accord's forward elements alone, 60,000 warships, before the fleet's main body fully committed. Their resistance was not trivial. Human ships took damage. Human crews died. I have the casualty figures, and I will not reproduce them here without noting first that they matter, that they have names, and that the asymmetry of the final numbers should never be allowed to obscure the fact that the Iron Accord was not a one-sided operation. The people who served aboard those ships had volunteered for a mission whose parameters they understood fully. The Directorate had not concealed from the fleet's crew what they were being asked to do or why. The crews knew the Mercy Corridor casualty count. They knew the 31 ship designations. Many of them had served in the Tier A at some point in their careers, or had family who had. They went anyway. The Iron Accord was built by people who planned it, crewed by people who flew it, and authorized by people who understood what authorizing it meant. None of those groups were operating in ignorance of the weight. After the 4th hour, Vashtori resistance became sporadic, individual units acting without coordination, continuing because they had no alternative order to follow and no command infrastructure through which an alternative order could have arrived. The fleet absorbed those engagements and continued. The Vashtori had no functioning fleet after hour 6. They had no communication network after hour 11. They had no central government in any functional sense after hour 17. At 19 hours and 41 minutes, the fleet's commanders certified operational completion. The fleet held position for 4 hours, running continuous sensor sweeps to verify. Then it began its withdrawal. No parley was conducted. No surrender was accepted, because the structure through which a surrender could have been transmitted no longer existed. No territory was claimed. No occupation was established. No reparations were demanded. The Iron Accord fleet withdrew on the same course it had come. When the Directorate released its formal account of the response, transmitted to every interstellar authority that would accept it, in every translation the Directorate's language service could produce, it stated one thing that I have found in the years since to be the sentence that mattered most. I helped write it. I was in a hospital bed on Kalos when the Directorate's communications team asked me, as the Mercy Corridor's sole survivor of record, whether I wanted to contribute to the formal statement. They did not ask for victim testimony. They did not ask for an emotional account. They asked if there was one thing I wanted the statement to say. I thought about Captain Tolev's voice on the ship-wide channel, even and deliberate, in the last minutes she spent buying seconds for her crew. I thought about the 6 hospital ships going first. I thought about 43 surgeons in a forward hold, with the Red Cross plaque lit from the inside, 200 kilometers visible, perfectly readable, to every weapons officer on every targeting display in the Vashtori formation. The statement read, in the relevant part, the Terran Directorate does not claim that this response was proportionate. Proportionality was not the measure applied. The measure applied was sufficiency, sufficient to ensure that the Vashtori Dominion, or any successor entity, or any observing party, understands with complete certainty that the killing of designated non-combatants under the protection of a recognized interstellar compact will not be absorbed, negotiated, or forgotten. It will be answered. The scale of the answer is the answer. That was the sentence I gave them. They kept it intact. The Cathara Compact Authority issued a formal condemnation of the Iron Accord action. The condemnation was filed, acknowledged, and not responded to. 6 of the Compact's 11 non-human signatories privately contacted the Directorate through back-channel communications in the weeks that followed. The nature of those communications was summarized to me as seeking clarification of the Directorate's future intentions. The Directorate's response was consistent across all 6. Humanity had no further offensive intentions. The Iron Accord was a specific answer to a specific act, and the Directorate would act in full conformity with any compact or treaty it remained a signatory to. The implication, which required no explicit statement, was that humanity was capable of leaving a framework when that framework was being used to shield predation, and capable of providing its own resolution when the framework could not. The back-channel inquiries stopped within a few weeks. Whatever calculus those 6 species performed in the quiet of their own deliberations is not something I have access to. But I know what the assessment data showed. I was discharged from medical care 7 weeks after retrieval and reassigned, at my request, to the Directorate's Post-Accurate Assessment Division. For the next 4 years, I worked in the group tasked with evaluating the long-term strategic consequences of the Iron Accord action, what it had changed in the behavior of compact signatories, what it had produced in the political landscape of the systems bordering Terran space, what it had cost in diplomatic standing, and what it had purchased in operational security for human non-combatants operating in interstellar space. The assessment work was not emotionally clean. The data on Vashtori casualties was in our files, and I read it and I did not look away from it. I added it to the same place I kept the 31 ship designations, and the 43 surgeons on the Covenant Reach and the individual crew, members I had watched moving through the escape corridor, whose pod signatures I had tracked until I cut the display feed. That place is not a small place. I have not found a way to make it smaller, and I have stopped trying to. The assessment division's work was methodical. We tracked every change in compact signatory behavior that could plausibly be attributed to the Iron Accord action using the clearest available metric: incidents of hostile action against human non-combatant shipping. This was not the only metric available to us. We also tracked diplomatic posture, transit right applications, the frequency and tone of back-channel communications, the deployment patterns of species with historical records of predatory enforcement actions similar to the Vashtoris. But incidents against non-combatant shipping was the most concrete, the hardest to obscure, and the most directly connected to the lives of the 214,000 people whose deaths the Accord was a response to. There were other things the assessment work produced that I will mention because they belong in an honest record, even though they are less clean than the zero incident statistic. 3 of the compact signatories used the period following the Accord action to renegotiate transit right terms with human parties in ways that, on examination, turned out to benefit those signatories. They were not threatening us. They were updating their assessment of what terms they could get from a party that had demonstrated a certain kind of capability and willingness. Some of those renegotiations produced terms less favorable to human relief operations than the prior agreements had been, in ways that were below the threshold of hostile action but above the threshold of neutral. The Directorate accepted those terms. The calculation was that accepting them was less costly than the alternative, and that the alternative would have been interpreted as a willingness to conduct additional Accord-scale operations over commercial negotiating positions, which was not a precedent the Directorate wanted to establish. This is the complexity I mentioned earlier, the part that does not resolve cleanly into a triumphalist account. The Iron Accord action produced a measurable improvement in the safety of human, non-combatant operations in the sector. It also produced a set of secondary effects that required careful management for years afterward. The universe did not become simple because one dominion had been removed from operational existence. It became different, and different required the same discipline of analysis and response that had produced the Accord in the first place. What the assessment produced, over 4 years of careful analysis, was a body of evidence for a single conclusion that I will state plainly. In the 36 months following the Iron Accord action, the rate of armed interference with human relief operations in interstellar space dropped to a number that, when I first reviewed the quarterly dataset, I checked against the collection methodology 3 times, because I assumed an error somewhere in the aggregation. There was no error, 0 incidents, not statistically negligible, not within the margin of measurement uncertainty. 0 incidents of hostile action against any human relief vessel, convoy, or station operating under compact protections or TRA certification across the entirety of a sector that had produced 22 hostile incidents against human non-combatant shipping in the preceding 11 years. The species of the compact had done the only kind of calculation that matters in the architecture of deterrence. They had looked at what humanity had assembled without announcing it, at what humanity had done with it when given cause, and they had adjusted their models accordingly, not reluctantly, not with protest. Quietly, the way you adjust a model when the data requires it, and you do not have a compelling reason to refuse the data. I am not writing a triumphalist account. I want to be clear about that. Problems evolved. New actors emerged in the sector in the years that followed. The Directorate's strategic posture continued to develop in response to a universe that did not stop changing because one compact member's government had been removed from operational existence. The political landscape of the sector in the decades following the Accord is complex, and anyone who tells you it is simple is selling something. What I am writing is an accurate account of what happened and what it produced. And part of what it produced was 36 months of zero incidents for human non-combatant shipping in the sector where the Mercy Corridor runs. That is not nothing. That is in fact everything that the Mercy Corridor was ever supposed to be. A lane where relief ships could move without being killed for it. There is a point in the escape pod's black box record where the continuous recording captures me talking. Not transmitting, the pod's comms were in receive-only mode for most of 3 years, conserving bandwidth for the beacon. I was talking to the pod's interior, which is to say, I was talking to myself, or to the people who were no longer alive to hear me. The forensic team offered to let me review that portion of the recording before it became part of the formal record. I declined. I know what is there, in broad terms, and the formal record does not require me to annotate it. I talked to Captain Tolev. I talked to the 43 surgeons by name. Working through the manifest I had memorized from 11 days of reading it. I talked to the crew members I had watched moving through the escape corridor, the ones whose pod signatures I had tracked on my display until the display started showing destruction events faster than I could process them, and I cut the feed. I talked to the Covenant Reach itself at one point, which is the kind of thing that happens to a person's categories after a sufficient duration of isolation, and which I offer without apology. What I did not talk about in those recordings was rescue. I had made a deliberate decision in the first 2 weeks not to structure my mental life around the expectation of retrieval. Not because I thought retrieval was impossible. My professional assessment was that it would eventually come. But because structuring your survival around an expectation is structuring it around something outside your control. In a single-person pod in a debris field, control over one's own mental architecture is the only sovereignty available, and I was not prepared to hand it to an expectation that might not arrive on any schedule I could predict. So I did not wait. I analyzed. I built the model of what had happened and revised it as the months produced internal data. The kind of data that comes not from new inputs, but from the slow compression of existing inputs under sustained pressure. The model grew more complete. The hypothesis about the Vashtori's expectations grew more settled. The working conclusion about the Directorate's likely preparations grew more specific, though it remained a hypothesis without confirmation. What I discovered over those months was something I had not expected, that the analytical work was not a distraction from grief, but a form of it. Working through the Vashtori's legal framework in detail, reconstructing the decision chain that produced the 40-minute sweep, modeling the expectations they had built from 4 prior enforcement actions. All of it was a way of taking the weight of 214,000 dead and doing something with the weight that was not simply bearing it. Analysis was what I had to offer. It was the only instrument I possessed that was equal to the scale of what had happened. And using it was the only way I knew to honor the fact that what had happened was worth understanding rather than simply mourning. Around month 20, I arrived at what I believe was the most accurate formulation I was capable of reaching without access to classified material. The Vashtori had calibrated their action against the observable record of human response capacity. The observable record was accurate. The variable they had not accounted for was the unobservable record. 11 years of construction in concealed facilities. 11 years of deliberate silence from a directorate that understood the value of being underestimated. I held that formulation through the remaining 14 months. I did not know about the 580,000 hulls. I did not know about the 7 dry dock facilities, or the asteroid fields, or the procurement records that hid the hull components in plain sight. But I had spent a professional lifetime learning to assess what people and institutions were capable of when they had sufficient cause and sufficient time. The Directorate had both. When Vorn finished his briefing and left me alone in the recovery suite with the data pad and the final numbers, I sat there for a long time. I did not feel satisfaction. I want to be honest about that, because the popular account of how survivors respond to answered grievances tends toward a particular emotional narrative, and I am not going to perform it. What I felt was the end of a specific kind of noise, the noise of an incomplete sentence that had been running since the moment I watched the Covenant Reach fracture apart at 112 meters. A suspension that lived in the grammar of something unfinished, something that had been issued in full, the attack, the killing, the 40 minutes of sweeping, the formal notification of a matter considered closed, but had not yet received its reply. The Vashtori Dominion had issued a statement about how things would go. The Iron Accord had issued the reply. The sentence was complete. That is not a comfortable thing to say. I am not saying it because it is comfortable. I am saying it because it is accurate, and because accuracy is the only form of respect I am capable of offering to the 214,000 dead and to the people who built the answer over 11 years of careful, quiet work. The Iron Accord fleet is in standby configuration in the Outer Terran system. It has not been demobilized. The Directorate has stated publicly that it will remain in standby for as long as human non-combatants operate in interstellar space. The remaining compact signatories are aware of its existence, its location, and the conditions under which it would activate again. Those conditions are specific. They involve non-combatants. They involve clearly marked vessels. They involve protections that have been formally guaranteed and formally signed. The formal statement does not elaborate on what would follow if those conditions were met again. The Iron Accord accession already provided that elaboration in terms that do not require supplementary explanation. The hospital ships went first. That stays in the record as the first thing, because Captain Tolev used her last minutes to buy her crew whatever seconds she could, and she deserves a record that is honest about what she was buying them against. The black box clock read 1,176 days, 18 hours, 32 minutes, and 14 seconds when the retrieval vessel's collar sealed against my pod. The clock never stopped. Neither did we.